And this session is going to be all about how to succeed in your synoptics. I'm not doing it as a slideshow. I've popped it up in my PowerPoint, in my PDF annotator, so that I am able to circle and highlight the bits that I'm talking about. But the slides, I will pop those into the chat box right at the end of the session so that you have them to refer back to if you want to. And just really for me to get an idea as to where you're all at, if you'd like to just pop into the chat box which level you're currently studying, that would be really interesting for me. Great, so we've got some level 3 and some level 4 here. Fantastic. Quite a mix there of people at level 3 and level 4. No one mentioned level 2 yet. I will very briefly cover all levels, but we do focus on level 3 and level 4. Now, you may be aware of some changes that have been happening at level 3. I'm not going to spend too much time focusing on those. At the end, we will have a little bit of time available for some question and answer. So what I will do is I'll stop the recording, and if anyone has got any questions that I may be able to help with in terms of the changes that have happened at level 3, we'll look at that a little bit later on. But there is quite a lot of information that's been coming out from the AAT about that. So let's get started. What we're going to cover in this session, first of all, what a synoptic is. We'll have a look at the structure of the synoptic and the knowledge you're expected to have on going into that synoptic assessment. We'll pick up on what some of the common mistakes are, and we'll look at how you can try and overcome those. So anticipate those things that could cause you issues so that you don't make those same mistakes. We'll have a look at some written questions. So all of the synoptic at each level has an element of written response. If you're doing level 4, all of your assessments will have an element of written response. So the tips, the things that I talk about there will be relevant for all written response questions. We'll then have a look at what resources are available to support you in not just your studies, but also for preparing for that assessment. And then we'll have a look at a few key points from level 4 and from level 3, together with a few study tips. So to give you a little bit of a background, my name's Crystal. I'm one of the tutors at First Intuition. I've worked in the Cambridge office for a period of time. I have certainly focused on AAT. In fact, I've been responsible for the development of our AAT programme, resources and apprenticeships. And I've been very involved in developing our whole programme offering. So I know these synoptics quite well, and also the AAT syllabus. I've been involved with it for quite a long time. I'm also a tutor across all qualifications, and therefore I've dealt with the written response questions and preparing learners for the more discursive questions for many years now. Probably, I'm going to say around about 15. I think it's longer than that. I'm not going to dwell on that for a long time anyway. So hopefully I can pass some of my experience and some of my knowledge across to you to help you prepare for your synoptic assessment. So starting with, what is a synoptic? So synoptic just means it's holistically testing a number of different areas together. So the assessment is going to draw on skills, it's going to draw on techniques, theories and knowledge that you have covered across a range of units. So different areas of the qualification are going to be tested together. Learning outcomes from the different units are going to be tested together. And it's really going to test your understanding of the integration of those areas. Now, lots of the learning outcomes will be tested fairly individually, but you are expected to be able to appreciate how all of those units that you will have studied interact together. With the AAT Synoptic Assessment, at each level you have one synoptic assessment, and it will test your knowledge on a number of units, but not necessarily all units at that level. So we'll look at what units get tested at each level in the Synoptic. Some of the units are only tested in the Synoptic assessment. Some of the units are tested in part in the Synoptic assessment, but they also have their own unit assessment. And that's something really important to remember, that those units that have their own single unit assessment, that single unit assessment will be testing against all the learning outcomes and all that assessment criteria that you see in that unit specification. It's then tested as part of the Synoptic, but it won't be tested as a whole. It will be certain learning outcomes, certain assessment criteria that will be tested as part of the Synoptic. And we'll look at that as we go through. For those units that are only tested in the Synoptic, all of the learning outcomes and assessment criteria, that entire knowledge for that unit will be tested within that Synoptic assessment. Doesn't mean that you get a question on every area of the syllabus, but it means you need to know the whole syllabus to prepare for the assessment. So that's what our Synoptic assessment is. What's included at each level? So at level 2, the Synoptic assessment will test bookkeeping transactions, bookkeeping controls, elements of costing, and working effectively in finance. Now, these 3 have their own unit assessment, and therefore it's just some learning outcomes that are tested in the Synoptic. All of this will be tested in the Foundation Synoptic. So similarly, when we get to level 3, we've got our advanced level, our advanced Synoptic. We've got advanced bookkeeping, final accounts preparation, management accounting, costing, which all have their own individual unit assessments. So elements of those will be drawn into the Synoptic assessment. And currently, under the AVSY assessment, professional ethics and spreadsheets for accountants have no separate unit assessment. They're both only tested in the Synoptic. Now, some of you may have heard about changes happening to the advanced level Synoptic, where these 2 are being split out, or spreadsheets is being set out. That will be for assessments that are taking place after the summer. So if you're taking your AVSY assessment in July, then you will be sitting this current assessment where spreadsheets and professional ethics are within that AVSY assessment. And at level 4, it is the 4 core units that are tested within the Synoptic. These 3 are budgeting, decision and control, and financial statements. They all have their own individual unit assessment. Accounting systems and controls is only tested in the professional Synoptic. So elements of these will be included in the Synoptic. All of the learning outcomes are being tested from the accounting systems and controls. So it's really the structure of the assessments, and I've touched on there a little bit about the knowledge that you need for those assessments. So either the whole unit or partially some of the learning outcomes, in order to make sure that you are fully aware of which learning outcomes you're going to be tested on. I can't stress enough how useful the test specification is. So if you log into your My AAT and you go to the unit resources for the Synoptic, so whether that's advanced or professional, or even the foundation, within there's a document which has got the detail on all of the units at that level. So you've got a test specification, or you've got, I'm trying to think of what the other word for it is. It's a document that details everything about that qualification overview. That's the word that I'm looking for. So there's a qualification overview, and within that, you'll have the details of all the learning outcomes for every unit. If you look in that specifically at the pages that relate to the Synoptic, it will detail in there the test specification. And in that test specification, it will tell you which learning outcomes from which units are being tested in that Synoptic. And that's really, really important, particularly if you are self-studying, if you're leading yourself through your studies, depending on where your resources are coming from, that's going to be a really useful document for you to understand what do I need to revise from those units that I've already sat. It will also tell you about the weightings. So it will give you an idea of the emphasis of the exam, of the assessment on each of those areas of learning. So that can also help you to understand how much time you should be spending in each area preparing for the assessment. So that's your test specification. Definitely recommend having a look at that quite early when you're preparing, when you're studying for your Synoptic, but also as you're getting towards those final preparation stages and you're looking at revision and mock question practice, just go back and have a look at that to check those learning outcomes and the weightings. What you need to know, you need to understand the knowledge from all of the units that are included in that assessment, but in relation to the learning outcomes that are in that specification. So it can help you decide what you need to revise. It also gives you a little bit of an indication as to how those learning outcomes might be tested within the real assessment. So we've got our management accounting and our financial accounting. Just thinking at level 3, we've got financial accounting and management accounting, which have their own unit assessment. They're going to form part of the Synoptic alongside ethics and spreadsheets. So we're going to be looking at being tested on our understanding of ethics within a financial or a management accounting role, scenario, context. We'll be tested on spreadsheets in a financial accounting or a management accounting environment. So that's where it becomes Synoptic and all of those things linked together. The same at level 4, where we've got our accounting systems and controls. We're looking at those in terms of our management accounting, budgeting, decision and control environments, and in our financial accounting environment. So we're going to be looking at the controls that are appropriate and relevant in those areas. We're going to be looking at accounting systems that enable us to be able to perform the techniques, the activities that fall under management and financial accounting. The structure of the assessment will include some extended writing, and this is challenging. It does make the assessment harder, where we are expected to prepare a written response, and I know that often it is found to be more difficult. All I would say is the extended writing is a real opportunity for you to demonstrate and show your knowledge and understanding. It's a real opportunity for you to be able to show that not only do you know, but you understand as well. And although they are hard, the questions do require more from you. There's also less right or wrong for the answer. There's much more opportunity to justify the answer that you've given, to give more detail, to give more understanding of the context in which your comment is being made. We're going to have a look at that extended writing task, and we're going to have a look at verbs. Some of you may have seen some of my sessions that I've done before, or our podcast that we have where I've talked about verbs. It's something which I do have a bit of a bee in my bonnet about. Understanding the verb and addressing the verb in your answer is absolutely important. We're also going to have a little look at what you get in the SAMS documents. As part of looking at the extended writing tasks, I'm going to pick up on the usefulness of the SAMS and the practice assessments that you've got available to you to prepare. Are we all good? Any questions so far at all? All okay. Good. So, common mistakes within the Synoptic assessment, and we're going to look at how to address some of these through the rest of this presentation as well. But I just want to highlight some of the things that go wrong and what you can try and do to make sure you don't make that mistake. So the first point is this: descriptions of key terminology or techniques or principles is weak. This is testing your knowledge. You should have good knowledge. Make no assumptions. So if you're asked to explain the purpose of budgeting, so say at level 4, the purpose of budgeting, you really need to explain what budgeting is and why it is used, what the reasons for it are. The technical knowledge that you have, make sure you can make someone understand what it is. A good way to practice this is to I don't know, maybe drag a family member in, a friend, and say to them, I want to explain a few things to you. Tell me if you get what I'm telling you, and really go through your course notes for that unit and look at the terminology, the techniques, the principles, and have a go at explaining them to that person and see if they can understand, describe them, make them understand. If you're not able to explain a principle or technique, that really is going to limit your success in the written tasks. Lack of detail when asked for description or discussion. If you're asked to discuss something, you're not being asked to state. State is very basic, low-level verb, whereas a discussion is a much higher level verb, and you have to do much more in your response in order to meet what that verb is. So these common mistakes are things that have been picked up by the examiners and have been put in the examiner reports, and in every report they talk about this, a lack of detail when a particular style of question has been asked for. So make sure you say enough. Not provided in the context of the scenario. This is kind of a regurgitation of knowledge rather than making the knowledge relevant to the scenario that you've been given. So say the question that you've been given is about a restaurant. If it's about a restaurant and you start talking in terms of, I don't know, maybe you're talking raw materials. Well, you shouldn't be talking raw materials. You should be talking ingredients. We're looking at a restaurant here where its ingredients are their raw materials. If you're talking about a firm of accountants, perhaps, don't talk about customers, talk about clients, because that's how we refer to those people within that kind of business. Maybe the scenario that you've given is a sole trader business. Don't talk about things that aren't relevant to a sole trader, that are relevant only to a limited company. Your question is asking you about a sole trader. So make sure that you explain things that are relevant to the scenario that you're given and put them in the context of the scenario. So say the scenario you've got identifies that there's a cash shortage. You need to bear that in mind in your response. Don't go making a recommendation and a suggestion that they spend loads of money on something that they just don't have. Maybe look at what would be appropriate in the context of this scenario and use that in your answer. Not following the task requirements and instructions. We're going to look at this. So this is where you might be asked to evaluate and then recommend, and rather than recommend, you state a number of options. If you're asked to recommend, you must give a recommendation. There's no point saying, well, you could do this, or you could do that, or you could do this. What you should be saying is, I recommend that you should do this. So follow the requirements of the task. Lack of demonstrating accounting knowledge in the response. Just remember, the exam is about getting your AAT qualification. So it is an accounting qualification, and you should be making sure that your response is demonstrating your knowledge, understanding, skills and abilities from a finance perspective. Too narrow an answer, just not writing enough. And I think something that is really important here to consider is how many marks is there for your response. You could be asked a question and you're told that there are 8 marks available. So AAT are really nice. They tell you how many marks are available for each question part that you're being asked. If the question says there's 8 marks available and you write 2 sentences, there's no way you could be covering enough to answer that question effectively. Your answer must be so narrow and so focused on such a small part of what the response needs that you would not be able to pick up good marks for it. So make sure that you're answering enough. This could also be where you're asked to evaluate the issues that have occurred, and you focus on one issue, but the scenario pointed out 4. Well, if the scenario pointed out 4, unless you're asked to only focus on one, if you're asked to evaluate the issues, that's all of them. So you should be mentioning all 4 of those. Otherwise, your response is just too narrow. Repetition of the same point. Let's say the same thing in a slightly different way and hope the marker doesn't notice and give me marks for it. It won't happen. It will get picked up. So don't waste time doing that. Think of something else valuable or expand on your point better rather than just repeating it. So already mentioned this, short answers where there are multiple marks. It's as a marker, it's very frustrating when you're marking an answer that is, say, 8 marks available and the response you're marking has got 3 or 4 bullet points in it. So short, sharp bullet points. It's just not enough. If you're asked to do explain, discuss, evaluate, that definitely wouldn't be enough because it's too short. And you need to consider how many marks am I trying to pick up here? If I'm trying to pick up 8 marks, then I probably need to be saying 8 really good things to get those 8 marks. Only considering one of the issues or examples, so I mentioned this, you've got 4 issues, you pick up on 1, you're really limiting yourself. Focusing too much on the numbers, you will have been tested really well on your ability to be able to calculate the numbers in the specific unit assessment. So when it's coming to the synoptic, where there's the opportunity to test you on more than just that technical knowledge, it's being able to test your understanding. If you just do the calculations and show the numbers without any kind of explanation or evaluation alongside it, you're not really going to be getting enough in there. Poor presentation of response to multiple requirements. We'll look at multiple requirements in a moment, but if a question is asking you 3 things, put some little headings in there for each of those 3 things that you're then answering, rather than it all being just kind of dumped into one paragraph where it might jump around all over the place. So think about how you're presenting your answer and how it's going to pick you up marks. So I know talking about the synoptic here, we're focusing very much on those written questions, and that's because this is where I see the most challenges or the most issues. The written questions are definitely where people struggle the most. So at level 3, we've got written questions in terms of ethics, and at level 4, those written questions could be in terms of accounting systems and internal controls, as well as the budgeting and financial knowledge. So written questions, what do you need to think about? 3 things I think are really important in tackling written questions. The first thing is What's the command verb? We'll look at what some command verbs are in a moment, but make sure you take note of what you're being asked to do. Another part is interpreting, well, what actually does this question want me to do? It can be very easy to misinterpret a question and kind of go off on a tangent. And this is really about practice. The interpretation of a question is about reading questions, having a go at them, and then seeing whether you hit the mark. Did I interpret it accurately? The other part is identifying when you're being asked to do multiple things. And that might sound like a really basic point, but in the pressure of an exam, under that time pressure, and also with the kind of anxiety and nerves that go along with sitting an exam, it can be very easy to miss part of a question. So you could be asked to explain this and recommend an action. 3 things you'd be asked to do there, and you could get so wrapped up in doing the first 1 or 2 things that you forget about the third one and you don't do the recommendation and you miss out on some easy marks or some very important marks there. And I do think it is slightly more challenging with written questions where we are doing them on screen. When it was paper-based, so I personally sat all my exams when they were paper-based, and I used to get the requirement and I'd circle each of the parts and I would number it so I could tick it off, which we just can't do. But you can use the scratch pad to do that. You can use Notepad depending on how you're sitting your assessment, and you can jot down just maybe 3 points on the 3 bits that you need to make sure that you answer and tick off as you do them. So I've got a few examples to go through. This is an example from a question that is in one of the practice assessments. So the AAT provide for us practice assessments and also these SAMs, sample assessment and mark schemes. And I really, really like these SAMs documents. So the practice assessments are fantastic. You have 2 of them to do for each unit. And I'm sure if you're partway through, you've been using these on your My AAT account. If you've been looking at the answers, the PDF that's given to you of the answers, you hopefully will have noticed that sometimes there is a SAMS, or one of them will be a SAMS document. There's certainly SAMS documents for the Synoptic assessments, and it's a sample assessment and mark scheme. And what it does is it gives you a model answer, but it gives you much, much more. So it gives behind it the kind of mark guidance and the mark scheme that goes with that written response. And it's really, really useful to have a look at that. But this is from one of the questions that we have in one of the practice assessments. And you'll see here that you're being asked to explain. So explain, that's the verb. That's important. Explain means make me understand. It's not state, it's not describe, it's explain. And out of explain, I'd expect to be able to understand what you're telling me. Explain the ethical issues. So what are the ethical issues? There's an S on the end of that. There's more than one issue there. So we need to be picking up multiple things. A little bit further on, it says refer to the conceptual framework. I'm being asked to do something else. So I'm being asked to explain more than one issue. And for each one of those issues, I need to be looking to refer to the conceptual framework. So my professional ethics, which of my fundamental principles are in, does this impact or does this refer to? I need to refer to that framework as part of that explanation. So explain the ethical issue with reference to the conceptual framework where relevant. And that's something else which is really important, is picking up on this word relevant. So don't just list all of them, because not all of them will be relevant. Which one is specifically relevant to what you've just explained? So you're asked to do a few things there. You could just very, very quickly read through that requirement and miss some of the opportunity to pick up marks because you miss out some of that requirement. So a little bit more on identifying multiple parts. And there's another reason I'm picking up on this one as well, and we'll have a few slides that look similar to this. So evaluate is the highest level verb. That's really giving the biggest kind of discussion, explanation. Evaluate is asking you to really look at the size, scope and impact of whatever's been given to you. So evaluate, is it good or is it bad? How good is it? How bad is it? Is it just a little bit good or is it a big bit good? So that's what evaluate is really looking at. So evaluate the layout and presentation, two things. So you're looking at evaluating how good is the layout of the information that's been provided, how good is the presentation of that information that I've been given. You're then asked to include one recommendation for improvement. Make it a good one, make it one that you can explain well. So a few things asked for in that requirement there. You'll see below here, I've got a banded mark scheme, and you'll see these in the SAMS documents, particularly at level 4. These come up across all of the assessments. At level 3, you will see this in some of the questions for that is really looking at ethics. A banded mark scheme, there's 7 marks available for this part A, and your answer will fall into one of these bands. And what you're given here in this SAMS is, well, what needs to have been said in that answer for that student to fall in that band for that answer. And it's really, really useful to spend a bit of time looking at these banded mark guys to get an understanding as to how much detail you need to go into in order to pick up higher level marks in the assessment. We'll look at that in a slightly more detail. I think it's over the page. Nope, not this one. Next one. This is just another example. Assess 2 of the production manager's 4 proposals. If you assess all 4 of them, well, you've wasted some time because it's only asking for 2. The verb is to assess as well. In your response, recommend an alternative for both proposals you choose. Those recommendations have to tie up to the proposals you've chosen, 2 out of the 4, and there has to be 1 for each of those. So being asked to do quite a few things. Part B here, outline 1 analytical method for evaluating internal controls. So this is from a level 4 paper. And how you would apply it. So you need to outline it, and then you need to explain how you would apply it. So being asked multiple parts there. And this is another example of a multiple part question. So this is from a level 3 question. You're being asked to reply to this email that you've received, addressing all the points that have been raised. So in the email, what points have been raised? You need to give a brief description of the company, a summary of the position as owners of the business as it becomes limited company, and explanations of 1 key advantage and 1 key disadvantage of operating as a limited company. So actually, there are 4 things that you need to address in your reply here. So I said I was going to mention verbs. I will try not to get too carried away with this. I think I could fill a whole hour talking about verbs, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to point out how important they are. These are the kind of command verbs you can see in questions at level 2, 3 or 4. They do vary as to where the emphasis is, and the higher level verbs are tested at level 4 with the much lower level verbs at level 2, and level 3 has a little bit of a mixture in between there. When I say about the lower level and higher level verbs, evaluate is a high level verb, justify is a high level, discuss is a high level, a lot is expected of you. If you're just asked to identify or describe, those are much lower level verbs, and the emphasis, what you have to do, is much lower. What I have included in here is a bit of a description as to what you would have to do in order to address each one of the verbs. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will share this with you so that you have this available. There's also on the AAT website some kind of practices at addressing verbs. So within some of the resources, the support resources, there's some quizzes and tests that look at sort of matching up verbs, seeing if you can identify what you're being asked to do with them. So what one should we pick up on? Describe. Describe is about identifying and explaining, giving across what the main characteristics, details and quantities of something are. So what are the features? Describe them. Tell me what the features are. Compare. Compare is about giving reference to what the similarities and the differences are between something you've been given. We have more over the page, so there's a bit of a description of each of the verbs there in that wheel. As I mentioned, some of these are higher level verbs, so these ones are definitely higher level verbs. So something like recommend. Recommend means that you have to give a justified opinion or a justified suggestion. So put forward a preferred option or course of action. And the most important thing is you say why. So you don't just say, I recommend you purchase machine B. Well, that could just be a guess. It's not going to get you many marks. I recommend you purchase machine B because, and then you explain your reasons why you've chosen that as the best option for the scenario that you've been given. Justify, again, is to give the arguments for. Justification is very positive, it's supporting, it's arguments for, it's giving the reasons for a particular course of action. So maybe someone has said, it's already been told you this is the action that should be taken. Can you justify it? You need to give the reasons for why that should be the course of action. So command verbs, very important. Here we've got an evaluate and a recommendation within a requirement. And I'm just going to pick up on what this means in terms of the mark guide. And this banded mark guide, we can see here for this question, there's 7 marks available. And you're being asked to evaluate and recommend. If you're only getting 1 to 2 marks, that's due to only stating, not evaluating. So if you're going to state and give a simple explanation, you're going to get very few marks. If you manage to give a slightly more detailed explanation, so a detailed assessment, and you're able to address that recommendation, you'd be moving up into that next band. So you'd be picking up 3 to 4 marks. In order to get that highest level of marks, you would need to give a comprehensive assessment that meets that evaluation verb. A comprehensive assessment that has been well explained and a recommendation that is clearly justified. That's going to get you those higher level of marks because you're addressing what those verbs mean and you're addressing all parts of the requirement. So I'm going to leave the verbs there, the approach to written questions there, but hopefully that might give you a few pointers that can help you to pick up more marks in the exam or know how to tackle those written elements. There are plenty of resources available to support you in preparation for your synoptic assessment. Make sure that you've used them. Make good use. So AAT, for every unit, there's some study resources, and that's the same for the Synoptics as every other unit. There are some e-learning items. Some of them go into the verbs and requirements. You have those practice assessments. To sit alongside those practice assessments, you have some SAMS documents, so sample assessment and mark schemes. In those, you've got details of how the marks are allocated, and as well as having that kind of model answer. Really, really worth looking at. And then you have your green light questions, which I'm sure you've come across already. Great for testing your knowledge to make sure that you're ready, you're in a good place in terms of knowledge. Specifically for Synoptics, there are some e-learning writing skills. If you haven't used those yet, absolutely recommend them. So lots there to support you with preparing for the assessment. One thing that I would like to point out is that the practice assessments at level 4, they focus on a different pre-scene to the pre-scene that you will see in your assessment. I don't think that matters. It is still good to have a look at them and see the kinds of questions that are asked and the way in which those responses are prepared, and then how they're marked. This is an absolutely useful document. So within the AAT resources, there is an examiner's report for every single unit at AAT, and they are so useful. Within that, the examiner will go task by task and will say, these are the things people do well, these are the things that people don't do so well. So it can really help you. Make sure, don't fall into the same trap as the people did last year. So it gives a very balanced assessment across all of the responses that will have been produced. Oh, someone in the way to me. There we go. Also in the examiner's report, there's a little bit of an overview as to what that task is about and what's expected of you. Definitely use it. Key part of your revision is to look at that examiner's report. You may or may not have come across AAT comment as well. AAT comment is really useful. You can access it through your membership area on the AAT website. And in AAT comment, there's a massive wealth of articles, and lots of those articles give kind of study tips. They will give synoptic specific tips, as well as there being kind of technical articles as well. There's flashcards and things like that. It can help you across all of your units that you're studying. So if you haven't seen AAT comment before, absolutely recommend that you have a look on there and you have a look at how many resources are available to support and help you there. And some of the articles will have additional comments and they'll have follow-on articles. Really useful. I'm sure there's a few articles on there that come from our tutors and lots of specialist training providers and in the industry to help you with your exams. So I wanted to pick up on a few key points from level 3 and level 4. So starting with level 4, the Synoptic is about more than your knowledge. It's about your ability to be able to apply your knowledge to a given scenario, that you have that knowledge of the pre-scene information, you understand the business that really you're involved in. Treat it as if that is where you work, so you know that business that you're in, and these are questions that are about that business in that pre-scene scenario. You'll be given extra information. You've got to be able to interpret that additional information in the context of the pre-scene that you've been given. And the questions that you're asked, you have to make your answers relevant to that scenario in the pre-scene. It's about your understanding of that knowledge. It's about your ability to be able to apply that knowledge. It's quite skills-based. And it's really testing more than just your technical sort of understanding or your technical knowledge. Pre-seen, really important. Make sure you consider the industry that you're within. So currently we've got Veggie Delights. So we're looking at restaurants. Make sure you bear that in mind in your responses. What's important for them? What's good performance? What's bad performance? What kind of costs? Where's their revenue going to come from? What sort of people are going to be their customers? There is no expected format either. So don't think that I've done 4 questions. They were all very similar. I'm going to go in the exam and that the question's going to be similar to the 4 that I've done. It won't be. It's testing your knowledge and understanding. So it could be asked in a different format. You will be tested on the same things. You'll be tested on the things that you will have covered in your mocks and in your practice questions, but they could look different in the exam. Don't be alarmed by that. Really think about, well, what is it that I'm being asked to do here, rather than what am I being asked to do in a completely different format to what I've never seen before. It's about what you're being asked. Focus on the requirement. What evidence can you use to justify your point? This is really, really important. So what do you know from the pre-seen? What do you know from the scenario information that you've been given that will enable you to justify that point that you're making in your answer? Justify your recommendation, justify your action or your description. And do what the verb asks. Define, explain, justify, provide examples, illustrate, use some numbers from the question to illustrate your points. Recommends, whatever it might be, do what it asks. At level 3, there is a guidance document that's available, and there is some resource that's on the AAT in your login there, which will tell you what to expect in the exam, how the exam is going to perform, what you can expect to see in terms of the timing. So from start to finish, how is it going to feel for you? Really good to sort of know what to expect. So a useful document there. Practice assessments. So particularly in terms of doing the spreadsheets part of the assessment now, you may have printed notes in a folder. You might have printed mocks that you're reading them whilst doing it up on screen. When it comes to the exam, it's all going to be on screen. So make sure you practice having multiple documents that you're switching between, that you're referring to, up on your screen. So practice your mocks in the way that you're going to do them in the real assessment. Ethics is about having a good knowledge, but knowledge alone is not going to get you through the ethics part. You have got to be able to apply that knowledge to scenarios that you're given. So question practice is absolutely key when it comes to ethics at level 3. Spreadsheets. Make sure that you understand spreadsheets in an accounting environment, that you're not going to see anything that you wouldn't expect to see working in a finance role when you come to do your real assessment in terms of the spreadsheets section. So practice questions again there, different types of questions. Make sure you check what you're being asked in the requirements as well for the spreadsheet part. Does it ask you to do it with a formula? Does it ask you to reference to a cell on a current sheet or a previous sheet? Really, really make sure that you follow the instructions. Don't shortcut anything. If you're asked to use a formula, make sure you do use a formula, because if you don't, you're not going to get those marks. One thing that's just on seeing so many mock exams where I've had students who have been preparing for the spreadsheets part of the assessment. I know that data validation is something that lots of people find hard. Make sure you can do it. I mean, don't think that, oh, it's all right, I'll just highlight the cell and I'll change the color myself. That's not going to get you the marks. You must use data validation and things like conditional formatting. And as I note there, read the instructions, follow what you're being told to do. Don't shortcut anything, because if you shortcut it, you are going to lose marks, and that could be the difference between passing and failing. And finally, my study tips. I think I've probably already mentioned these. Make sure you've got all of your specific unit knowledge. Go back to the test specification, see what learning outcomes are going to be tested, and make sure you revise that knowledge. Those that are only tested in the Synoptic, you need to have a good range of knowledge across that whole unit. Use the AAT resources, those practice assessments and mocks. Do as much question practice as you can. You don't want to feel alarmed when you get into that exam, and you don't want to feel that a question looks very different to what you've seen before. Practice as much as you can. If you are studying with a training provider, so if you are with us at First Intuition, your tutors are there to support you. They will mark assessments and they will give you feedback. That feedback is absolutely vital. It can really help you to understand where your weaknesses are and where you need to focus your attention. So wherever you're studying, utilise that tutor resource that you've got. Make sure you have a go at completing things to time as well. Easy to run out of time, particularly at the level 3 assessment. I think level 4, it's also a lot expected of you. You could get very carried away on one of the written questions. So plan how much time you'll be spending on each task and try to stick to that. I mentioned those SAMs and the examiner's reports. Really, really use those. Now, where I've put here, take your time. Take your time on the requirement. Read the requirement. What's the verb? What different things am I being asked to do? Make sure you address all of those. Don't skim that requirement. Don't skim the information that's given to you. That information that's given in the question, in the requirement, is there to make sure that you give the right answer. So take your time over that. Also, allow yourself a little bit of time at the end to review what you've written. Does it make sense? Have I answered all parts? Take the time to read back through your answer. I've put here that you should check your answer at midpoint and at the end. Now, this is something which is a really, really good habit to get into. So when you've got a written question and say it's for 8 marks, read the requirement, plan what you're going to answer, read the requirement again, start writing your answer. About halfway through, just stop, go back, have a look at the requirement again. Am I still on track, or have I started going off on a tangent and answering a question that I wished it was, not what it actually is? Really, really useful. And check at the end, have I addressed everything? And finally, use your support network. So use friends and family to say, can I explain some stuff to you? Can I describe some things? See if they understand. Maybe speak to other people you know who are studying. Ask them to have a go at marking your work for you. Offer to mark their work. It's really enlightening how useful that can be to mark someone else's answers, because you will find things that you think, oh, they didn't do that, they didn't say that, and it will help you to improve your answers as well. So just as a final point there's my email address, our website, and the address for AAT comments. So I am going to pop into the chat box now a copy of this. I say that, I'm hoping I'm going to pop into here a copy of it. Let me see if I can find it. So I see there's a question there, will bullet points be okay? It depends on the verb. So bullet points don't always answer the verb that's been asked. So if you can use, here we go. Sorry, just pop that into the chat box, that will upload. So if your bullet points means that you write 3 or 4 words, that definitely is not going to be enough to evaluate, justify, describe, explain. It's not going to do those things. If a question asks you to identify or to list multiple things, bullet points would be fine, because you would only need to give a few words. If your bullet points are 2 to 3 sentences long, then that would be fine. The fact that it's got a point in front of it wouldn't be an issue at all. But most important is considering how much you're writing and does it address the verb. And if you feel that bullet points restricts you, it makes you very short in your answers, I would say don't use them. Stick to sentences and paragraphs. Just one more note there on paragraphs, like do split out paragraphs. So don't just write a whole load of text without any space in between. AAT are nice, they give you plenty of space. So stick a return in between your paragraphs and make it nice and easy for your markers to see what you've written and what you want marks for. Best to do the same before or after practice. I would say always make sure that you have got one mock that is your final kind of, that's my last hurrah, that's the bit that I'm going to do just before the exam. But I would definitely have a go at doing maybe 1 or 2 mocks or one of the practice assessments at least before looking at the SAMs. So then you can kind of assess yourself, how well did I do? So you can have a go at doing those questions. Then in the SAMs, you can really look at what that banded mark guide looks like and the model answer, and you can see whether you were on the right track or whether you've got quite a lot of work that you need to do in order to sort of bring your response up to the level that's needed. But if you can leave a final mock as your last, like, I'm going to put everything into this, I'm going to do it as if it's the exam, to really see how you do, but also to give yourself the confidence that when you go into the exam, you know what to expect. Examples be good. Yeah, absolutely. Pull from the question and provide examples to demonstrate your point at every opportunity. And if it says to illustrate, you must give those examples as part of your response. Definitely.